we were not an ally, but the emphasis on partnerships actually helped India to deepen the relationship. And I think that has worked much better under Biden. I would say on the positive side, given the foundations that have been laid by Trump, my sense is there will be significant continuity, irrespective of who wins the election.
In this week's column in Rajamandala this week, you looked at Joe Biden's legacy now. The US campaign heats up. We forget he's still the sitting president. On this coming Saturday, there's going to be a summit-level meeting with Prime Minister Modi and other Quad leaders in Wilmington, I think, which is his hometown, President Biden's hometown. You've looked at his legacy vis-a-vis India. So, one of the things I wanted to ask, the first thing was that, as you mentioned in the piece itself, that starting with Bill Clinton's visit in 2000, there's been more or less a bipartisan consensus towards growing ties with India, and India also responding in kind, beginning with Vajpayee, then strengthened by Manmohan Singh, and then taken to new heights by Prime Minister Modi. What was the apprehension when Biden took over after Trump, who really deepened ties, and how do you think he sort of met those, either denied those apprehensions or?
The issues came from the fact that Trump broke from the traditional US consensus. Yeah. So for example, on Afghanistan, I think US had intervened US had come back into Afghanistan in end of 2021 following the 9/11. Trump was hinting at withdrawal. He was not interested in staying on. The second was the nature of the importance of Pakistan for the US, which was tied to the first factor. Yeah. And the third was the question of China. In all the three, Trump had made big moves towards one, withdraw from Afghanistan. He didn't do it, but he wanted to. And then he said Pakistan was double dealing with them. On the one hand, supporting Taliban, and on the other, taking US money. And three, the question of that China is a problem, because for 30, 40 years before that, US viewed China as an important partner. So I think what was not clear at the end of 2020, when the November 2020, when the elections were taking place, if the Democrats would continue with these three changes, because after all, they broke the consensus. And the fear in Delhi at the time was that the US would go back to, Pakistan and stay on in Afghanistan. That would keep Pakistan's importance for the relationship. Otherwise, he would go back to saying that, look, China is not a problem, we'll deal with them. So for India, I think the Trump era saw this break away from Pakistan, challenging China, provided a basis on which India would go up in the importance for the United States. So there was widespread skepticism Biden might simply go back to the Obama years, where these three issues were dealt with in a different form. But I think quite surprisingly, I think Biden pulled out of Afghanistan within a few months after coming to power, and that freed him from the Pakistan as well, because the reason why Pakistan was so important was because of the US was intervening in Afghanistan. And then the China policy, in fact, the US said, look, they're going to go with the Trump policy on China. And to add more good news for India, if you will, was to Biden systematize this whole policy of dealing with the China challenge. And Biden also elevated India's importance in this scheme of things. So that's what happened, and I think nobody expected him to continue with the Trump policies on these three issues, and I think those have worked in India's favor.
So another factor, you've made this point in earlier columns, and you hinted it in this one as well. Everyone should read the column. It's on theindianexpress.com, and there should be a link wherever you're watching this video in the description. Is that so? Trump was anti-China, but in other ways there was a lot of fear about Trump's. I'm sure it still exists. There's another election coming of Trump not working, or NATO should pay its fair share, getting out of Europe, pro-Russia. But whereas on China, the Biden administration has also worked through allies. So say even in the Indo-Pacific and with the Quad. How do you see that playing out, not just vis-a-vis the US, but vis-a-vis the other middle powers and in this region?
No, I think it's a very important point. I think Trump said, look, he doesn't care for alliances. allies of free riders. They take benefit of the US, but they give very little in return. And they put a lot of pressure on the European allies like Germany, as well as the Asian allies like Japan and South Korea to contribute more for defense. This argument did not, we didn't have a problem with that argument because India is not an ally. And unlike Germany or Japan, India does not depend on the US for its security. So it was not a direct effect for India. But I think the approach of Trump was saying that, look, so narrowly constructed in a transactional manner about so-called self-interest. So the danger for India from Trump was, while his approach to China put India at a higher plane, that there was a transactional element to it, and that he would treat every relationship purely in terms of give and take. And India had some problems with Trump, for example, on the question of trade issues, on the trade deficit issues. Trump was deeply concerned about India's trade surplus with the US. So the style, I mean, was a concern for India, though India had a reasonably good relationship with Trump. But the concern that this style would complicate matters for engaging with the US. For example, I mean, he had Imran Khan in the White House and called him as a beautiful, handsome leader. And the idea was entirely because he wanted Imran's help to get out of Afghanistan. So I think there was an unpredictability about Trump. There was about a individualistic approach to foreign policy. While I think what Biden did was to systematize it, that better organized, more coherent in terms of its basic ideas as well as its implementation, and the emphasis on partnerships. We are not an ally, but the emphasis on partnerships actually helped India to deepen the relationship, and I think that has worked much better under Biden. While the larger aim has remained the same, which is how do you balance Asia with a more stable structure.
So, one thing you point out in the piece, which is interesting, I didn't know, was that, say, for example, the cooperation on the economic and technological fronts, which is a real plus. I mean, there's of course there's security and there's thing, but on a sort of money basis and bread and butter, you're competing on tech. I mean, we're cooperating on technologies. There was the ISET, which was a huge gain, which India didn't have this kind of technology sharing thing earlier. How do you see, now, at what point there's government. So, the big one for us is this Apple store opening in India. Apple coming to India is a huge thing with both manufacturing and so which we didn't know. Indian startups, actually, their biggest defense startups. US is a market for them, a destination market among if not the biggest, if not the biggest. How do you see this government's role in this kind of private sector engagement now? Now there's semiconductors, it's going to be strategic industry, so the government will have a role. But to what extent? Both governments.
Now, I think, for example, I think the emphasis on de-risking from China and the need to create alternative supply chains, that led the US, to start telling its companies, look, as a long-term question, it's better you get out of China. I mean, not everybody has gotten out of China, but Apple, for example, slowly began to manufacture in India. So I think this idea that you can't have too much exposure to China, to one country for your manufacturing, which is a lesson that the US learned from the pandemic, that I think began to work in India's favor. That Apple has slowly, still, I mean, a lot of manufacturing goes in China, but I think the decision to shift some production into India, and much of that production is taking place within the private sector. The second aspect, I think, historically, when we always talked about technology with the Americans. Look, give us technology, give us technology. But that argument was largely about government science and technology agencies getting technology from the US. It did not have an industrial component. But if you look at today's technologies, for example, semiconductors, governments can only do this much, but there's really a private sector-driven enterprise in the US. So therefore, I think the idea that you need to bring the Indian private sector together with the US in order to leapfrog to things like semiconductors. That I think that commercial dimension to technology, the industrial dimension to technology, which did not exist before, has been taken front and center, is again linked to the strategy of diversification away from China, the need to have alternative sources for the production of equipment and components. So these have worked in favor of India, where the Indian private sector today, Tata's, for example, are working closely with several US companies to develop semiconductors of various kinds. That's happened. Many of these were tied up when Prime Minister Modi went to Washington in June 2023. Agreements were made on boosting India's semiconductor capability. Similar things are happening in space, and as you said, it's not just the big companies, smaller companies startups. That is one part, and even Indian private sector. Sorry, in the Indian public sector. For example, the jet engine technology. We're talking about US GE, which is a private company working with HAL, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, to produce aircraft engines for the next version of the Tejas aircraft. So I think it's both private and public, but the enterprise level engagement as opposed to lab scientific departments getting technology to industrialization. So I think this fitted well with India's own attempt at diversifying away from China. That I think as trade deficit mounted with China, India decided to stop reliance on China, produce manufacture within India. So therefore, I think the US need to de-risk and the India need to build a defense industrial base, have come together to produce important gains for both sides. As you said rightly, India is gaining from the investment of the US tech companies in India. And Indian startups are also contributing to US defense and US industry by contributing a variety of benefits in terms of the new innovations that are going from Bangalore to the United States.
The final question now. So Biden's had a pretty good record with India in that sense. This 4 years has been good for bilateral ties. What is the next? What is the next step in this kind of engagement to deepen it, to de-risk it?
I think this now is a two-horse race. So we know it's between Trump and Kamala Harris. Since we worked with both the administrations, there is not much anxiety in India. But I think if Trump comes back, there will be questions on trade, and I think Trump really quite neurologic, if we say, about trade deficits and trade issues. And I think India, things in particular, is a problem because of India's high tariffs. So there are going to be issues in relation to that. And second is it's not clear if Trump understands the importance of technology transfer. He might say, look, why are we giving things to India? I mean, let's sell things to India.
Yeah.
So for him, the kind of strategizing that went into the Biden administration's semiconductor and other technology policies, it's not sure. But I would say on the positive side, given the foundations that have been laid by Trump, my sense is there will be significant continuity, irrespective of who wins the election, because once you set up things, once businesses are getting along, then I think that gives it a more solid footing. And as I said, really for Trump's problem is really for Europeans and for Japan and South Korea, who fear that he'll simply turn isolationist and abandon them and will not make efforts to support the security against Russia in Europe and against China in Asia. That's part of the problem. India does not have that problem, but India still would want a US that is globally engaged, not just on security, but on climate change, but on other larger issues. So I think that's where I think India, while it's not directly affected by Trump, it will still have some concerns. On Kamala Harris, of course, she's been part of this administration. So India would expect some continuity, but I'm sure she'll bring her own worldview to this if she gets elected. But on the core issues on both sides, the China question, I think, is likely to remain front and center. That in itself will provide significant ballast to the relationship. Second, I think it is the B2B, business to business relationship, which has grown, which provides a stable footing to the relationship. And I think it is this new stability, I think we mentioned this in the article, that has allowed to weather some of the difficulties that have come. For example, there's a lot of criticism in the US about India's position on Russian invasion of Ukraine. There is this whole controversy about allegations that Indian officials were involved in trying to kill a U.S. citizen. And then the third is the differences on Bangladesh that we've seen before. I think differences are natural between large countries, and we're not no two countries, even the U.S. as best partners, agree on everything. But I think the question is really, do you have the capacity to manage those problems? And I think what we've seen in the last 1 year, while the new problems have come to the relationship, the essence, the fundamentals of the relationship are good. Therefore, they're today committed to managing those differences while continuing to advance on the bilateral relationship. And we'll see at the Wilmington Summit if something more interesting developments will take place on both bilateral as well as on the Quad level.
Yeah, right, sir. Thank you so much, sir. We will talk again next week with the next column. Everyone, read the column. It's on the Indian.U.S. Thank you so much.